My hands were shaking when I sent the distress signal, not because I expected anyone to answer. I sent it because it was the last thing I could do for my people. The Sirith fleet was broken. 17 ships remained from what had once been 400. Our fuel reserves were at 11%. Our wounded numbered in the thousands, and we had lost count of our dead somewhere around the second orbital bombardment of our homeworld. I am Velkan, senior archivist of what is left of the Sirith Collective, and I am writing this record not for myself, but for whoever comes after us, whether that is our children or the historians of another species entirely. The Kethvar Dominion did not simply defeat us. They systematically erased us, world by world, station by station, as if they were completing administrative tasks. There was no rage in their campaign, which made it worse somehow. They moved through our space with cold efficiency, glassing our colonies and dismantling our orbital infrastructure before we had even finished evacuating civilians. I watched our homeworld burn from the bridge of the archive vessel Remembrance, and I recorded everything because that is what archivists do. We record, even when recording means watching children run through corridors that are filling with smoke. We escaped because of Navigator Doran. She plotted a jump sequence through a gravitational anomaly that the Kethvar warships could not follow at speed. She saved 4,000 lives with her mathematics. She died 2 days later from injuries she had hidden so that no one would remove her from her station. I recorded her name at the top of the survivor ledger, which is where it still sits. So when I sent the distress signal, I sent it into the dark the way you drop a stone into a well you believe is empty. You do it because the motion itself matters. You do it because stopping feels like agreeing to disappear. The answer came in 47 minutes. Not a recorded message, a live voice. A human voice, speaking in Galactic Common with a slight accent I did not yet recognize as West African in origin. The voice said, "This is Admiral Yara Ose of the human fleet station Bastion Solis. Your signal indicates severe hull damage and medical emergency. We're reading 17 vessels in your group. We're sending coordinates for a safe approach corridor. Come toward our beacon. We'll sort the rest out when you get here." That was all. No conditions, no questions about what we could offer in return, no diplomatic preamble. Just coordinates and the word come. Fleet Commander Bryn stood beside me on the bridge when we received the message. He was the highest-ranking military officer still alive, which says everything you need to know about what we had survived. He was a quiet man who had not slept in 6 days, and his uniform was still stained from the last emergency he had managed with his own hands. He listened to the message twice, then looked at me and said, "Do we trust them?" I did not have a good answer. Humanity was young by galactic standards, barely a century into faster-than-light travel. We had trade agreements with them and a few scientific exchanges. We knew they were resourceful and occasionally surprising. We did not know what they were in a crisis. "We trust the Sathematics," I said. "We have 11% fuel. We cannot reach any other friendly system." So we turned our ships toward the human beacon. Nothing I had read about humanity prepared me for Bastion Solis. I had expected a way station, a refueling post perhaps, or a modest defensive platform the humans used to guard this sector. When Bastion Solis emerged from the darkness as we approached on our final fuel reserves, I stood at the observation window and I could not speak for a long moment. What I was looking at was not a station. It was a fortress the size of a small moon, and it was armed in ways that I, as an archivist with access to galactic military records, did not have classification for. The outer hull was layered in overlapping armor, plating that I later learned could withstand sustained capital class bombardment for nearly 8 hours. Weapon platforms jutted from every angle, each one capable of independent targeting. There were docking bays large enough to hold our entire fleet with room to spare. Sensor arrays swept the surrounding space in overlapping fields that left no blind spot larger than a few hundred meters. Between the main structure and the outer defense perimeter, 3 additional rings of automated weapons platforms orbited in slow, constant rotation. And none of that was what made me stop breathing. What made me stop breathing was what was happening out before we had even docked. 3 human engineering ships were already repositioning, aligning themselves between our damaged fleet and the direction we had come from. They were extending a defensive grid, a network of linked shield emitters and early warning buoys, in a wide arc around our approach vector. They were not waiting to see if we were worth defending. They were already defending us. Before we had even exchanged a formal greeting, before they knew our names or our history or anything, except that we were hurt and running, I pressed my hand to the observation window. I do not entirely know why. Docking was handled by a young human officer named Lieutenant Colin Webb. He was perhaps 28 years old, with a calm voice and the kind of organized efficiency that suggested he had managed emergencies before. He guided each of our F-17 ships into berth with instructions, assigning medical teams to the most critical vessels first, coordinating fuel transfers, and fielding our panicked communications in 3 languages simultaneously. He never raised his voice. He never seemed overwhelmed. When the last of our ships was secured, he simply said, "You're all inside the perimeter now. Get some rest. The Admiral will speak with you in the morning." Inside the perimeter, those 3 words landed on me in a way I did not expect. Our medical teams were overwhelmed within an hour of docking. We had 411 critically injured aboard various ships, and our medical supplies were nearly gone. The humans moved without being asked. Within 20 minutes of our docking, human medics were moving through our ships with their own equipment. I watched a human doctor named Francis Okafor work on a Sireth child for 2 hours without stopping, speaking quietly to the child the whole time in words the child could not understand, but in a tone that needed no translation. When the child finally stabilized, Francis looked up at me, and she did not say anything. She just moved to the next patient. I found the children's ward at the 3rd hour after docking. A large section of Bastion Solis's interior had been cleared and set up with low beds and soft lighting. Sireth children, most of them separated from parents who were either in surgery or listed among the dead, lay sleeping in rows. And at the entrance to that ward, 2 armed human soldiers stood guard, not sleeping, not checking their equipment, simply standing there, watching the corridor, watching the dark beyond the door, making sure nothing could reach the children sleeping behind them. I stood in the corridor for a long time and watched those 2 soldiers. One was a tall young man whose name tag read G. Harlow. The other was a woman whose name tag read D. Nkosi. They did not know I was watching them. They were simply doing what they had apparently decided to do, which was stand between the sleeping children and everything outside. I went back to my small assigned quarters, and I sat down at my recorder. My hands were still shaking, but for a different reason than before. I opened a new file in the Sireth archive. I labeled it Record of First Contact with Human Protective Forces, and I wrote the first entry. They do not wait to be asked. They see someone in need, and they immediately begin building walls around them. I do not yet know what to make of this. I do not yet know what it means for us, but I know what I saw tonight. I know what I heard from Lieutenant Webb when he said, "You are inside the perimeter now." And I know what I felt when I looked at those 2 soldiers standing guard over children who are not their species, not their family, and not their responsibility by any law I know of. I felt something I have not felt since before our homeworld burned. I felt safe. The following morning, Admiral Yara Osei walked into the room where Fleet Commander Bryn and I waited, and she put a data slate on the table between us before she even sat down. The slate showed a tactical map. On it, the 17 remaining ships of the Sireth fleet were marked in blue. Around them, in a series of overlapping arcs, were the defensive systems of Bastion Solis, already redrawn to fully enclose us. Beyond the outer defense perimeter, 3 new rings of sensors and weapons platforms were being installed along the approach vectors, most likely to be used by Kethvar pursuit craft. "This is your defensive situation as of this morning," Admiral Osei said. Her voice was steady and direct. "Without ceremony or drama, the Kethvar will know where you are within a few weeks, assuming their intelligence networks are as good as your reports suggest. We are not going to pretend otherwise. So, here is what we are doing in the meantime." She sat down and looked at us both with dark eyes that had clearly seen a great deal without flinching from any of it. She was perhaps 50 years old, with short natural hair and the posture of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by hard things. "We are reinforcing this station's outer hull in sectors 9 through 14, she said. "We are bringing in 2 additional weapon platform tenders from our inner system to expand the coverage grid. We are fueling and repairing your ships, all 17 of them, to full operational capacity. And we are extending our early warning network, another 40 light minutes in the direction you came from, so that nothing approaches without us having enough time to respond." Bryn was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why?" Admiral Osei looked at him. "Why what? Why are you doing this? We have nothing to offer you. Our civilization is in ruins. We have no military capacity worth speaking of, and no resources that could benefit you. Why are you building defenses around us?" The Admiral was quiet for a few seconds. She picked up a stylus from the table and turned it slowly between her fingers. Then she said, "Because you're here, and because you're hurt. And because something did that to you that shouldn't have been allowed to do it." She set the stylus down. "We can argue about strategic value later. Right now you're inside our perimeter, and nothing is coming through our perimeter without a very serious conversation. I wrote that down in the archive that evening, word for word. I wrote it down because it was the kind of thing that should not be lost. That night, standing at the observation window of my quarters and watching the human engineering crews work in the dark outside, their suited figures moving along the hull of the station with the unhurried precision of people who expected to be doing this for a very long time, I thought about the young soldier, G. Harlow, still standing at the door of the children's ward. I thought about Francis Okafor moving from patient to patient without being asked. I thought about Lieutenant Webb guiding 17 broken ships to safety with a calm voice and steady hands. Humanity was young. By galactic standards, they were barely out of their own solar system. But there was something in them, some quality I did not yet have a name for, that expressed itself in the same way every time. The moment they decided you were under their protection, they stopped treating it as a decision and started treating it as a fact. You were inside their perimeter. The walls went up. The guards took their positions. The engineers started building, and the dark beyond the perimeter had better know what it was dealing with. Because these people were not building for show. They were building like they expected something to come, and they were building like they intended to be ready for it, and they were building like losing was not an acceptable outcome. I closed my archive file and went to sleep for the first time in 11 days. In the morning, when I walked to the children's ward to check on the young survivors, G. Harlow was still at the door. A different woman stood beside him now, but he was still there. He nodded at me when I passed, the quiet nod of someone who has been keeping watch and intends to keep watching. I nodded back, and I thought, we sent a signal into the dark because we had nothing left. And something answered, and it was building walls around us before we had even finished saying, thank you. The humans did not sleep the way we did. I learned this in the first week aboard Bastion Solis, and it changed how I understood everything that came after. The Sirath, like most species with a biological need for deep rest, treated sleep as sacred time. We went to sleep, we were gone from the world for 7 hours. And when we returned, we expected the world to have waited. Humans did not seem to share this expectation. They had developed something called a shift system, which sounds simple but is, in practice, a way of making a workforce effectively continuous. There was always a team awake. There was always someone working. When one group finished their shift and went to rest, another group, fully alert and already briefed, picked up exactly where the first had stopped. The result was that in the 3 months after the Sirath fleet arrived at Bastion Solis, the station never once went quiet. I used to walk the corridors at night, during the hours I could not sleep, and the engineering bays were always lit. I could hear the low vibration of construction equipment through the hull at all hours. When I looked out the observation windows in the dark hours, I saw suited human figures moving along the exterior of the station with lights on their helmets, working in the cold and silence of space without any apparent awareness that this was unusual behavior. Within the first month, Bastion Solis had grown. That is the simplest way to say it. The station grew. New modules were attached to the outer ring. The weapons platforms I had counted on arrival were not the final count, they were the starting point. New platforms were added, tested, calibrated, and integrated into the defense grid with an efficiency that reminded me of watching cells divide under a microscope. Each new piece snapped into place and became part of a system that was, every week, slightly harder to approach without permission than it had been the week before. I cornered one of the chief engineers in the corridor outside the main fabrication bay on a night when neither of us should have been awake. Her name was Clara Brent, and she was a small, compact woman in her late 30s with permanently tired eyes and the habit of wiping her hands on her uniform, even when they were already clean. She was carrying a data slate and moving with the purpose of someone who had 7 things to do and was already thinking about the 4th one. I asked her why they were building so fast. I told her I had been watching and I needed to understand. She stopped and looked at me with those tired eyes and she said, because the Kethvar aren't waiting. You believe they will come here? I believe that anyone who does what they did to your people does not stop because the survivors found somewhere to hide, she said. I believe that they will follow your signal trail, eventually, and when they find it leads here they will make a decision. And I want the decision to be very hard for them. She looked at her data slate, then back at me. So we're building. How long will it take? Clara made a short sound that was not quite a laugh. We'll be done when they arrive, she said, which means we will not stop. And she walked away. I stood in the corridor for a moment after she left, processing that. We will be done when they arrive. Not we hope to be done. Not we are working toward completion. We will be done when they arrive. She had set her schedule to match the threat, not the other way around. The Sirith Council convened in the third week to formally request asylum from the human government. It was the correct diplomatic step, and Fleet Commander Bryn handled the official portions with the dignity they deserved. I attended as archivist and recorded the proceedings. The human diplomatic representative who received the request was a man named Ambassador Colin Farrow, a tall and careful man who listened with complete attention and responded with precise language. He accepted the request on behalf of the Human Governing Council and expressed the sincere condolences of humanity for what the Sirith had suffered. Then he paused and added something that was not in the prepared text. He said, "I want to be clear that the protective measures currently underway at Bastion Solis are not contingent on the formal asylum process. Admiral O.C. made those decisions 3 hours after your fleet arrived, before any application had been submitted. The building you have been watching is not a diplomatic gesture. It is what humans do for people who come to us in need." Fleet Commander Bryn looked at me after the representative left. I had nothing to say, so I wrote it down instead. In the 6th week, I was invited to attend a strategic planning session. I did not know what to expect. Among the Sirath, strategic planning was a careful and lengthy process involving extensive documentation, committee review, and formal approval chains. What I found in the human planning room was Admiral O.C., 3 of her senior officers, and a holographic display table that currently showed every known Keth Var military position within 50 light-years. I sat down at the edge of the table and did not speak. I was there to record, not to contribute, but I watched. And what I watched was I struggled to describe in my archive entries for days afterward. The humans were not planning for survival. They were planning for dominance. I do not mean this in an aggressive sense. What I mean is that their thinking did not begin from the premise of how do we endure this and end at best possible outcome for minimal loss. Their thinking began from the premise of how do we ensure that whoever is threatening our people cannot continue to do so, and worked outward from there. The map on the table was not a map of places to avoid. It was a map of places that needed to become untenable for the enemy. One of the officers, a gray-haired man named Captain Philip Crane, tapped a section of the map and said, "If they're staging from these 3 systems, we need to make those systems expensive to operate from. We're not ready to move forward yet." Admiral O.C. said, "We will be in 3 months, 4 at the most. The new platforms are ahead of schedule. The point isn't being ready to move. The point is being in the right position when we do." She looked at the map. "If they come to us, they come through one of 4 corridors. Each of those corridors needs to be a mistake for them. Not a challenge, a mistake." I wrote that down word for word. Not a challenge, a mistake. In the 8th week, the Kethvar Dominion sent a formal diplomatic communication to the human government. I read a copy in my quarters that evening. It was written in the cold, precise language of bureaucratic authority, and it said several things in carefully arranged legal terms that amounted to: the Sirith are a condemned species. Their continued existence constitutes a violation of Dominion expansion rights. Harboring them places the human government in violation of Outer Systems Treaty obligations, and the Dominion expected human forces to stand aside within 30 days, or face the consequences of obstruction. It was the kind of message designed to make a smaller power afraid. It was specific. It cited treaties. It used the word consequences with practiced menace. It was exactly the kind of communication that had, throughout the Sirith diplomatic history, caused our councils to hold emergency sessions and send frightened negotiators. I read it twice, and then I went to find Admiral O.C. to ask how she intended to respond. She was in the fabrication bay, supervising the installation of a new long-range targeting array. She read the message on the data slate I handed her, while a crane moved a 16-ton piece of equipment over her head, without her looking up. Then she handed the slate back to me and said, "Get me the communication officer." She dictated the response herself, and I stood beside her and recorded it as it was transmitted. It was 1 page. It said, "The Sirith Collective is under human protection. The Kethvar Dominion is advised that any military action against vessels, personnel, or installations under human protection will be met with a full and immediate response. We do not recognize the validity of expansion rights as applied to the destruction of an inhabited species. Your 30-day window is noted. Proceed in that direction and find out what comes next." It was signed Admiral Yara Ose, Commanding Officer, Bastion Solis. No diplomatic language. No committee review. No carefully constructed ambiguity. Just a direct statement of fact. I walked back to my quarters and stood at my window for a long time after that. Outside, the engineering teams were still working. Clara Brent was probably somewhere on that hull right now, building. I thought about what it meant to send a message like that. The Kethvar had 400 warships in this sector alone. Humanity had bases and fleets, but they were not a proven military power at this scale. What they were doing was not a calculated strategic decision. It was a moral one. They had decided what was right, and they were acting on it, and the math of who was bigger had not meaningfully entered the conversation. I opened my archive and I wrote, I believe, I now understand what makes humanity different from every other species I have encountered in 40 years of diplomatic service. It is not their technology. It is not their adaptability. It is not even their frightening capacity for continuous labor. It is this. They do not calculate whether a thing is worth doing before they decide whether it is right. They decide if it is right first. And once they have decided, the calculation of whether it is worth it becomes irrelevant. They will pay whatever it costs. They will build whatever they need. They will stand in front of whatever comes. Because the decision has been made and they do not unmake decisions like that. In the 10th week, 3 things happened that I recorded as significant. First, the Sirith Council formally voted to dissolve its independent military command and request integration into the Bastion Solus defensive structure. This was not a surrender. It was a recognition that we had 17 ships and humanity had the resources to actually protect us. And that pride was a luxury. We had lost the right to when our homeworld burned. Fleet Commander Bryn submitted the request personally to Admiral Osi, and she accepted it without ceremony. She simply said, your people know these ships. We can use that. Welcome to the perimeter. Second, Clara Brent took me on a tour of the new defensive installations. She showed me the upgraded shield emitters, the new platform rings, the long-range targeting systems that could now engage threats at twice previous maximum range. She showed me the internal power grid upgrades that meant the station could sustain full combat operation for 72 hours without external resupply. She showed me the emergency medical expansion that had quietly tripled Bastion Solus's capacity to handle casualties. At the end of the tour, she looked at me and said, simply, 3 months ago this was a station. Now it's something that would take a very serious force, a very long time to get through. Do you think it will hold? I asked her. She wiped her hands on her uniform. It's not the station I'm betting on, she said. It's the people inside it. Third, in the 10th week, something happened that I did not record immediately because I needed time to understand it. Late at night, in the corridor outside the children's ward, I found Lieutenant Colin Webb, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, eyes closed. Not asleep, just resting in the way that humans sometimes rest, when they have been going too long. I sat down on the floor beside him because I did not know what else to do. We sat there for a while in silence. Eventually he said, without opening his eyes, how are your people doing? Slowly, I said, better than before. The children are eating properly now. The injured are healing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, good, just that, good, Lieutenant, I said. Do you understand what you are all doing here? Do you understand what it means that you are building all of this? That you are standing guard over our children? That your admiral sent that message to the Kethvar? He opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling. We're keeping people safe, he said. That's what we're doing. You might have to fight a war over it. Yeah, he said. Probably. Does that frighten you? He thought about this with what seemed like genuine consideration, not performance. Then he said, losing frightens me. The fight itself is just the fight. I wrote that down later. The fight itself is just the fight. Losing frightens me. In the 12th week, Admiral Osi called me into her briefing room and showed me a new map. The Kethvar had moved 3 of their main battle groups into positions that the Human Early Warning Network had now identified. They were positioning for something. Not yet moving, but arranging themselves the way a hand arranges itself before it closes. They're deciding, Osi said. And when they decide, they'll come through one of these 4 corridors. She pointed to them on the map. We've been fortifying all 4. She looked at me. I want you to understand that we are not waiting to see what they choose. We are ready for every option they have. You believe this will become a true engagement, I said, not just a threat. I believe, she said carefully, that when an organization does what the Kethvar did to your people, they have already told you everything you need to know about how they make decisions. They don't bluff, they don't posture, they decide and they act. She folded her hands on the table. So we're going to make sure that when they decide and act this time, they run into something they were not prepared for. And your people? I asked. How do they feel about this? You are to fight a war against a power that has not yet technically attacked you. They came after you, she said. You're inside our perimeter. That's close enough. That sentence stayed with me for a long time. Close enough, not a technicality. Not a legal threshold, a human threshold. You were under their protection and something was threatening you, and that was, to them, close enough to being under attack to require the same response. I went back to the children's ward that evening. The children were awake now, most of them, moving through the corridors with a little more confidence than they had shown in the first weeks. A few of them had started learning words in the human language from the soldiers and medical staff. I heard a small Cyrith girl say thank you to G. Harlow in English, and Harlow crouched down and replied to her in 3 words of Cyrith so mangled that it made her laugh. It was the first time I had heard a Cyrith child laugh since before our homeworld burned. I stood in the corridor and I pressed my hand against the wall of this fortress that humans had been building around us every waking moment for 3 months, and I thought about the HFY fleet arranging itself in the dark beyond our perimeter. And I thought about Clara Brent somewhere out on the hull right now, still building. And I thought about the message Admiral Osi had sent. Proceed and find out what comes next. I thought they were going to find out very soon, and I thought, for the first time since watching our homeworld burn, that I was not entirely afraid of what came next. Because what came next was going to have to come through this station, and this station was built by people who had decided, without hesitation, that we were worth building it for. That is not a small thing. That is perhaps the largest thing I know. The HFY fleet arrived at the edge of our detection range on a morning when the station was running at full operational capacity, and Admiral Osi had already been awake for 4 hours. I know the exact moment it happened because I was in the communications center, reviewing archive transmissions, when the early warning system registered the contact. The technician at the board, a young man named Pete Aldridge, looked at his display for exactly 3 seconds before he said in a completely calm voice, "Contact. Multiple contacts. Bearing 477 by 12. I'm counting." He paused. "I'm still counting." The count reached 416 ships before the leading elements of the HFY fleet fully resolved into sensor range. They were arranged in a formation I recognized from Cyrath military records as the Dominion's standard punitive strike pattern. It was the same formation they had used when they glassed our homeworld. It was designed to communicate inevitability. The pattern was meant to say, "This is what the end looks like, and it is orderly and total." I looked at that formation on the display, and for a moment my chest locked. I had seen it before because, the last time I had seen it, I had been watching through the observation window of the archive vessel. Remembrance as it burned everything we had ever known. Then Admiral Osi walked into the communications center and looked at the display and said, without any perceptible change in her voice, "All stations, combat readiness, begin the corridor protocol. Phil, get me firing solutions on all 4 approach vectors." Captain Philip Crane's voice came back over the intercom. "Ready on all 4. "Hold everything," Osi said. "Not yet." That word "yet" told me a great deal about how she intended to run this. She was not panicking. She was not retreating. She was choosing when to move, which meant she already knew how to move. The 4 months of building and planning and practicing had produced exactly this. A commander who could look at 416 enemy warships on a sensor display and say "not yet," because she knew the geometry of what she had built, and she knew the geometry of what was coming, and she knew that the right moment had not yet arrived. The HFY fleet sent a broadcast on open frequencies, the same bureaucratic certainty as their previous communication, now amplified by the presence of 400 warships. They announced that the human station Bastion Solace had been designated a military obstruction. They announced that the Cyrith were to be surrendered immediately, and the human forces withdrawn. They announced that failure to comply within 1 hour would result in corrective action. Corrective action. As if ending 4,000 lives was a correction. Admiral Osi listened to the entire broadcast, then she looked at Pete Aldridge and said, "Reply. No. Just no." A single word transmitted to 416 warships. I wrote it down in my archive and underlined it twice. I had been assigned a position at the secondary observation post for the engagement, which was an armored room off the main command deck, with a full sensor feed and communications access. Fleet Commander Bryn was beside me. The 17 Cyrith ships, now fully integrated into the Bastion defense grid, had taken up positions in the second defensive ring. Bryn was in constant communication with our pilots, who had been trained and drilled alongside human crews for the past 2 months. Outside, through the armored observation port, the dark was complete. There was nothing to see with the naked eye, not at these distances. What was happening was visible only on the sensor displays. 400 ships on one side of it and this station on the other, and between them a set of corridors that the humans had spent 4 months turning into something the Kethvar did not yet understand. I found myself thinking about Clara Brent, somewhere in the engineering section right now, but probably listening to the combat status feeds and wiping her hands on her uniform. I found myself thinking about G. Harlow, who I knew had been reassigned to an interior security post for the duration of the engagement. Still standing between the children and the dark, even now, I found myself thinking about Pete Aldridge at his communications board, young enough to have only been a child during the last major conflict humanity had fought, now calm as still water while 400 ships closed out on the station he lived on. Whatever humanity was, it had produced these people. It had produced them reliably, in number, in every department and post aboard this station. The Kethvar had designed their approach to begin their main assault outside what they believed was our maximum effective range. They intended to weaken the outer platforms in the opening phase before closing to decisive range. What they encountered instead, the moment they crossed into the zone their intelligence had told them was safe, was concentrated fire from 12 platforms they had not mapped, at a range they had not accounted for. The first minutes were not a battle in the way the Kethvar had expected. They were a lesson. 17 of their leading warships lost propulsion in the opening exchange, not fully disabled, not yet but slowed, struggling to advance or retreat effectively, sitting in a zone where every key system aboard them was now a priority target. The Kethvar formation began to shift, attempting to adjust their approach vector, moving to one of the secondary corridors. OC's voice came through the intercom, steady and without hurry. Rotate coverage to Corridor 2. Let them think they found a gap. There was no gap. There had never been a gap. Every corridor had been prepared. The Kethvar fleet, moving to what their instruments told them was a less defended approach, found themselves entering a zone where the weapons platforms in Corridor 2 had been waiting at full readiness for exactly this movement. I watched our 7 Cyrith ships perform maneuvers in the second defensive ring that I did not know our pilots were capable of. 2 months of drilling alongside human crews had changed them. They no longer flew like a battered refugee fleet, trying to survive. They flew like part of something larger, responding to the same coordinated command structure, holding positions under fire with a precision that I would not have believed if I had not been watching it on the sensor display. Bryn watched them too. He had a communications line open to the lead Cyrith pilot, a young officer named Vel, who had been 17 years old during the first Kethvar bombardment, and who had been flying combat missions since she was 18. I heard Bryn say to her quietly, "Hold your position, Vel," and I heard her reply, without a tremor in her voice, "Holding, Commander." 4 months ago she had been a refugee. Now, she was holding a combat position inside a human defense grid against the same fleet that had bombed her home, and her voice was steady. That is what the humans built. Not just platforms and shield emitters and weapon arrays. They built this. The ability of a 19-year-old Sirath pilot to hold her position under fire because she had been trained by people who did not accept losing as an outcome. Bryn was watching his pilots too. He had a secondary communications line open through the engagement, a quiet channel he kept live so that our pilots could hear his voice even when he had nothing specific to say to them. I had noticed this in the second hour, when I realized the channel was open and active, and Bryn was simply sitting with it, present. Not transmitting orders but available. A steady frequency the pilots could check if they needed to know someone on the other side was listening. I mentioned it to him during a period in the engagement. He said, "They're a long way from home. They should not feel like they're alone out there." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Where did you learn to do that?" He looked at me. "From watching them," he said, and he nodded toward the human crew around us. He was right. That quality, being present for the people under your protection, even when presence is not tactically required, was not something the Cyrith military had formalized as doctrine. It was something Bryn had absorbed in 4 months of watching how the humans operated and then applied in his own way, in the middle of a battle, because it seemed right. That is a kind of learning that does not happen from training manuals. It happens from being near people who have made certain choices so naturally, and so consistently that the choices become visible as choices, things that can be recognized, borrowed, carried forward. I wrote it down, not as strategy, as character, because the archive is for both. The battle lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. I say battle, but what happened in the third hour was something I have struggled to describe accurately. The Kethvar fleet, having taken serious losses in both primary and secondary approaches, attempted to regroup and push forward in a massed central thrust that was, from Cyrath military records, the Dominion's final option when all tactical flexibility was exhausted. It was a powerful and concentrated advance, hundreds of ships forming into a single driving force aimed at our center. What OC had not told me, what I did not know about until that moment, was the fortress ships. I had noticed them when we first arrived. 3 vast structures docked in the deepest bays of Bastion Solace. Structures so large, I had assumed they were parts of the station itself, permanent and fixed. I had never asked about them because they looked like they had always been there and always would be. They were not permanent. They moved. When the Kethvar central thrust reached the inner defense perimeter, and the main engagement should, by any calculation, have become a close-range struggle with an uncertain outcome, the 3 fortress ships separated from Bastion Solace and advanced to meet the Kethvar formation. I watched them on the display with a feeling I still do not have a complete word for. They were mobile fortresses, each one as heavily armed as a small military installation, each one capable of independent sustained combat, and together they formed a wall that the Kethvar central thrust drove directly into. The Kethvar momentum broke against them. Not gradually, quickly. The fortress ships absorbed the thrust, held their positions without retreating a single kilometer, and returned fire with weapons arrays that I watched dismantle the leading Kethvar heavy warships in a manner that was, from a purely mechanical standpoint, precise to the point of seeming almost calm. There was no frenzy in it. There was no waste. The fortress ships did what they had been built and positioned and crewed to do, and they did it completely. What I remember most clearly from the 3rd hour of that engagement is not the sensor data, not the weapons exchanges, not even the sight of the fortress ships advancing. What I remember most clearly is the sound of the communications channel. Human voices, steady, brief, and precise, moving between stations across the entire defense network with the practiced rhythm of people who had drilled this so many times that the emergency had become in a strange way ordinary, not cold, not mechanical, but contained, managed. Each voice doing its single job within a larger system that held together because every person in it understood their role and trusted the people around them to understand theirs. I had been in emergency situations before. I had been aboard Cyrath military vessels during skirmishes on the outer colonial borders. I knew what command channels sounded like when things went badly. There was a particular quality to fear under pressure, a thinning and speeding of voices, a tendency toward redundant communication as people sought confirmation that they had been heard. I recognized that quality. I had heard it on our own bridge when our homeworld burned. I did not hear it on Bastion Solace's communications channel that afternoon. What I heard instead was something I later tried to explain to the Cyrath Council when I gave my formal account of the battle and found I could not translate it adequately. The closest I came was this. These people had prepared for this so thoroughly that the worst moments of the engagement felt, from the inside, like a test they were confident they had studied for. The fear was not absent. I know it was not absent, because I spoke to people afterward who told me what they had felt. The fear was there. It had simply been given a specific and limited amount of space to exist in, and the rest of the space was occupied by function. Pete Aldridge, the young communications technician I had been standing near when the fleet was first detected, had been at his board for 6 hours straight by the end of the engagement. When the last contacts went dark on his display, and the channel counts dropped from combat levels to watch levels, he made a brief entry in the engagement log, flagged it as complete, and then put his head down on his arms for about 30 seconds. Just 30 seconds. Then he lifted his head, checked his board, and began running the post-engagement communication protocols. I watched him do this, and I thought, that 30 seconds is what the fear looked like. 30 seconds. When it was over, and he was certain it was over, and then back to work. I pulled up the flight recorder summaries on my secondary display and looked at our 17 Cirith ships. They had held their positions for the entire 4 hours and 17 minutes. Not a single one had broken formation without authorization. 2 had taken serious damage and continued operating in reduced capacity, rather than withdrawing. The lead pilot, young Vel, had flown the final 90 minutes of the engagement with a partially compromised navigation system and had not reported it until everything was over, because reporting it would have required her to leave her position. I wrote Vel's name in the archive separately, with a note, because she deserved to be recorded separately. Captain Crane came to the secondary observation post an hour after the engagement ended. He sat down across from me and Bryn and said, simply, "It's done. Then I'm sorry for your losses too, from our side." Bryn looked at it. "Thank you, Captain. We lost good people," Crane said. They would want to know the outcome was worth it. He looked out the observation port at the dark where the debris field was, though nothing was visible from here with the naked eye. I believe it was. He stayed about 10 minutes, then excused himself for post-engagement assessments. Before he left, he looked at me and said, "Are you writing all this down?" "Yes," I said. "Good," he said, and left. Captain Crane's voice came over the intercom. "Admiral, they're trying to pull back. Close Corridor 4, OC said. Nothing exits through Corridor 4. Corridor 4 was the retreat path, the last option for the Kethvar fleet, the vector back to their own space. And OC had prepared that corridor too. She had placed weapons platforms along Corridor 4, not because she needed them for the defense of the station, but because she had planned from the beginning that this engagement would not end with the Kethvar retreating home to prepare a second attempt. She had planned for this to end. Every ship in that fleet that had participated in the assault on the Sirith Collective, whose registration numbers were in the Dominion military records we had shared with the humans, was present. Every ship that had been in formation over our homeworld, every ship that had fired on our refugee convoys. They were all there, and none of them were going to go home and do it again. I pressed my forehead against the cool surface of the observation window. Bryn put his hand on my shoulder. Neither of us said anything for a long time. When the tactical display finally showed the engagement closing, when the last contacts resolved into debris fields and the sensor returns went quiet, I heard something I had not expected. A young human voice, distorted by static and the interference of the winding down engagement, broadcast on open channel before the signal cut. The voice said, "Tell the Sirith kids on Bastion, we held the gate." The name on the transmission log read, Lieutenant A. Ford. He was 24 years old. He had been piloting a support craft in the Outer Ring, covering a damaged Sirith vessel during the peak of the central thrust engagement. His ship had been lost 90 minutes into the battle. He had spent his last transmission making sure someone told the children that the gate had held. I sat down on the floor of the observation room, right where I stood. Bryn sat down beside me. The sensor displays were still showing their after-action readings. The fortress ships were returning to their docks. The platforms were cycling down from combat readiness. The early warning network was already re-extending to its standard range. Outside, through the observation port, the dark was still complete. But it was a different dark now. It was a dark we owned. I opened my archive file in the observation room, with hands that would not quite steady, and I wrote, "They did not simply fight for us. They fought until there was nothing left to fight. And one of them, a young man named A. Ford, who was 24 years old, used his last transmission to tell the children that they were safe. I play that recording every year. I will play it every year for as long as I have years to spend." Admiral Osei presented the Sirith Council with the counter-offensive plan on the morning after the battle at Velshari Gate, in a briefing room that still carried the faint smell of burnt systems and recycled air that combat operations always leave behind. Fleet Commander Bryn and I arrived together. Several council members were already seated. OC was standing at the head of the table when we entered, and the holographic map behind her showed something none of us had expected. It did not show the approach corridors around Bastion Solus or the defensive network we had just used to hold back 400 warships. It showed Kethvar space, their systems, their supply lines, their occupied colonies, their home territories. The council members looked at the map and then at each other. Elder Councilor Ran, who had been a senior diplomat for 30 years before the war, and who still carried herself with the precise formality of someone who believed deeply in procedures and proper channels, said, "Admiral Osei, with respect, we came here to discuss the security situation following yesterday's engagement." "This is the security situation," OC said. "This is a map of Dominion space." "Yes," Rand studied her. "You are proposing to enter Kethvar space." "I am proposing to end the Kethvar Dominion's ability to threaten any world that does not want to be threatened by them," OC said. "Which is what I believe your security situation actually requires." The room was quiet. I looked around at the faces of the council members. I saw fear on some of them, caution on others, and I understood the fear, because what OC was describing was not a defensive posture. It was a campaign into the territory of a power that had, until yesterday, possessed 400 warships in this sector alone. Those 400 were gone now, but the Kethvar Dominion was enormous. They had more. Councilor Rand said carefully, "We asked for protection. Admiral, we did not ask for a war." OC looked at her without impatience. "I know," she said. "You asked for protection. We're deciding that protection means making sure they cannot try this again." She let that settle for a moment. "We understand this goes beyond what you requested. You are welcome to register your objection." But we made a decision when you docked at this station, and that decision does not stop at surviving one engagement. Bryn leaned close to me and said, quietly enough that only I heard, she is going to do this regardless. He was right. What I was watching was not a request for permission. It was Ose giving the council the respect of explaining her reasoning before proceeding with something she had already determined was necessary. The humans had put 11,000 people into this conflict, and some of them had not come back. And Ose was not the kind of commander who watched her people die and then left the job half-finished. When the council members filed out after the briefing, each of them carrying the slightly stunned composure of people who had been overtaken by events they had not prepared for, Ose stopped me at the door. I need you with us, she said, in the field. You want me to come? I want a record of every world we liberate, of every person we find, every name, every colony, every piece of what was taken. She paused. Because this campaign belongs to your people as much as it belongs to anyone, and I want the archive to say that. I said yes without hesitating. The campaign moved through Kethvar, space with a momentum that the Dominion's scattered remaining forces could not meaningfully interrupt. They had lost their primary fleet at Velshari Gate. What remained was spread across dozens of systems, expecting to receive reinforcement that was not coming, operating on a command structure whose center we had taken apart. The humans moved with the calm precision of people who thought very carefully about what order things needed to happen in, and were simply executing that order. But at every world they reached, they stopped. That is the thing I want to be precise about, because it is the thing that reveals most clearly what humans actually are when they move through the world. They stopped and they built. The first liberated Cyrith colony world we reached was called Velmor, a small agricultural world occupied by the Kethvar for 2 years. When we arrived in orbit, the human fleet dispatched engineering ships and medical teams before the ground situation was even fully resolved. I went down to the surface with the advance team. Velmor had been changed in the way occupied worlds are always changed, which is to say that everything, which had made it a home, had been systematically replaced by everything that made it useful to whoever controlled it. The food production systems that had fed the Cyrith colonists had been dismantled. Kethvar extraction operations had taken their place. The people who remained were quiet and thin and careful, watching us from windows and doorways with eyes that had learned, over 2 years, to wait before trusting anything that arrived from orbit. A woman came out of one of the intact colony buildings and stood at the edge of the landing area. She looked at the human soldiers who had secured the perimeter, and then she looked at me, and she recognized a Cyrath face where she had not expected to see one, and she said, in Cyrith that was rough from 2 years of having no one to speak it with, "Is it over?" I said I believed it was. She sat down on the ground where she stood, not from weakness, just from the simple and overwhelming need to sit down after 2 years of not being able to. Clara Brent had come with the engineering team. I watched her walk through the ruins of the food production facilities with 2 of her colleagues, her data slayed out, measuring and noting, talking in the low practical voice she used when she was already planning a solution. She looked at one collapsed greenhouse structure for about 30 seconds, and then said to no one in particular, 6 weeks and this is running again. Maybe be 5 if the foundation is solid. I said to her, you are going to rebuild their farms. She looked at me as if this was the most obvious statement she had ever heard. Can't leave them with nothing, she said. And she went back to her measurements. The pattern repeated itself on every world. Secure the system, clear the Kethvar military presence, send in the engineers. Defensive platforms went up because the humans refused to move on without leaving each liberated world protected. Medical facilities were restored. Communication networks were brought back online. Human personnel stayed behind, not as a governing force but as a standing guarantee. You are inside the perimeter now. We are still here. Nothing comes through without our answer. Several of the species that had been under Kethvar control for decades were cautious, rightfully so. They had long experience with the arrival of outside military forces and the complicated obligations that tended to come attached to liberation. A species called the Then, who had been paying tribute to the Dominion for 60 years and lived in 3 systems along the inner border, sent armed ships to intercept our fleet when we approached. The intercept was tense. The Then ships moved into blocking positions with their weapons active, broadcasting warnings. Osi halted the fleet immediately and opened a direct communication channel. She talked to the Then commander for the better part of an hour. I do not have a full transcript of everything that was said, but I know what changed by the end of it. The Then commander asked Osi what the humans wanted in exchange for protection. what tribute or resource or political alignment they expected. And OC said, apparently, that they wanted nothing. That was not a common answer. The then commander asked 3 more times, different weights of fuego, before he accepted that she meant it. The then ships lowered their weapons and let us pass. 2 days after that, the then council formally requested inclusion in the coalition that was forming somewhat organically around the human effort. OC positioned one of the fortress ships in the then home system before we moved on. She did not announce it as a gift or a strategic asset or a show of force. She simply said, "You're inside the perimeter now," and moved to the next objective. I stood on the bridge beside her when she said that, and she did not look at me. But I saw the corner of her mouth move in something that was not quite a smile. She knew I had been listening. She knew I recognized the words. The coalition grew to include 6 additional species before the campaign reached the HFY core systems. Each new member brought their own reasons for hesitation, their own specific histories with the Dominion, their own fears about what it might mean to trust anyone at this scale. Each one was convinced not by promises but by evidence. The humans demonstrated, world by world, system by system, that their protection meant exactly what it said. They stood where they said they would stand. They built what they said they would build. They stayed. Lieutenant Owen Marsh, who had been assigned to diplomatic liaison work with the allied species, after the then joined, told me something during the campaign that I have thought about often since. He was 26 years old, from a small town in northern England, and he had a way of thinking about complicated things in very plain language that I found clarifying. He said, "The thing is, every species we meet has been let down before. Somebody promised them something and didn't deliver, or helped them and then asked for something in return, or protected them and then used that protection as leverage. So they're waiting for the part where we do that. And when we don't," I said, "then they don't know what to do for a while," he said, "and then they join." The soldiers who stayed behind on liberated worlds were not assigned there against their will. They volunteered, and there were always more volunteers than positions. I asked a young soldier named Marcus Cole about this on the second liberated Cyrith colony world, where he had been stationed as part of a 6-person security and engineering team. He was 22 years old and had grown up in the north of England, and he had a directness about him that reminded me of Clara Brent, the sense of someone who has already sorted out what matters and does not spend energy on what does not. I asked him why he had volunteered to stay on a colony world that had nothing particularly strategic about it, when there were other postings available. He thought about it for a moment, with the genuine consideration of someone who had not rehearsed the answer. Then he said, "Because someone should stay. Because if we liberate a place and then nobody stays, we've just left again." He looked at the rebuilt storage buildings the engineering team had been working on that week. And I like building things. I like being able to see what I did. I recorded his name in the archive the same way I recorded the names of the pilots and the commanders. Because Marcus Cole standing on a liberated colony world saying I like being able to see what I did is not a small thing. It is not a footnote. It is, in many ways, the whole point. The humans did not understand how to take credit for things that did not look like victories. But staying behind and building storage facilities on a colony world that nobody is going to write histories about is what makes everything else mean something. One moment from the campaign stays with me above all the operational details, and it happened on a world called Oresh, which had been under HFY control for 11 years and had never been a Cyrith world. The people of Oresh were a species called the Varesi, bipedal and gray-skinned, with large, light-adapted eyes, and they had spent 11 years learning to make themselves as unnoticeable as possible, because visibility under HFY occupation had led to conscription, relocation, or worse. When our fleet arrived in orbit and the HFY garrison withdrew, the Varesi did not come out to meet us. They watched from windows. They sent one representative to the landing area, a middle-aged Varesi woman who gave her name as Ores, and asked, in careful galactic common, what we intended to do now that we controlled their world. OC came down herself. She stood in the open landing area and said, "We don't intend to control your world. We're going to make sure it can't be controlled by anyone without your permission." Ores studied her with those large, cautious eyes. "And what does that cost?" "Nothing from you," OC said. "Everything has a cost." "Yes," OC said. "Ours is that we have to live with ourselves if we don't do it, so we do it." There was a long silence. Perez. Ores looked at the defense platforms the human engineering teams were already installing in orbit, at the shield emitters being positioned, at the communication arrays being restored to the surface infrastructure. Then she said, very quietly, I have not felt safe on this world in 11 years. OC looked at her and did not say anything. She did not need to. The Varesi joined the coalition 3 weeks later. Their representative was Ores herself, who turned out to have a deep background in interstellar law and a talent for negotiation that improved almost every agreement she participated in. Owen Marsh told me she was the best diplomatic mind he had worked with, which he said with genuine admiration and no apparent awareness that this said something important about what a species becomes when it finally has the safety to be fully itself. I wrote that down too. It belongs in the archive next to the battle records. The Kethvar ruling council attempted to negotiate a conditional surrender in the final weeks of the campaign. They routed their proposals through 3 layers of intermediaries, trying to reach the human government directly and negotiate a settlement that would avoid the humiliation of a formal defeat. Their proposals were detailed and in some ways reasonable, in the way that proposals from a position of weakness sometimes become reasonable. OC reviewed every proposal and rejected all of them, not the content of them, not the principle of negotiated peace, but the destination. Every intermediary was told the same thing. The Kethvar Dominion would surrender formally, in person, to representatives of the Cyrath Collective, with full galactic transmission and record. Any other arrangement was not on the table. The intermediaries came to OC directly when the 3rd round of rejections arrived, and the lead intermediary, a Delvari diplomat named Yessa, who had been navigating difficult negotiations for 30 years and who had a gift for finding workable compromises in impossible situations, said to Ose, "Admiral, I understand the principle, but surely a practical resolution that achieves the stated security objectives is more important than the formal symbolism of who receives the." Sirith watched their homeworld burn, OC said. They lost more than anyone. They get to receive this. That is not a symbolic decision. It is the correct one. She looked at Yessa with the steady directness that was her permanent mode of operation. If the Dominion has a problem with surrendering to the people they wronged, they can resume the conflict, and we can see how that concludes. The Dominion did not resume the conflict. I was present in the formal session when the Kethvar Council stood in front of Fleet Commander Bryn and Elder Counselor ran and delivered their surrender. I watched Bryn receive it with completely steady hands. 14 months ago, he had been standing on the bridge of a burning ship, asking if we could trust the humans. Now, he was standing in a formal session holding the surrender of the organization that had destroyed our homeworld, receiving it because a human admiral had insisted that it was ours to receive. I wrote down the date and the time and every name present and the exact words spoken, because that is what archivists do. And then I wrote one additional note that was not part of the formal record, which I have kept as a personal entry. She gave us this. She could have accepted the surrender herself and called it efficiency. Instead, she spent 2 weeks of negotiations insisting that it belonged to us. I do not know how to adequately record what that means. I will try for the rest of my career. After the session ended and the room was emptying out in the careful, slightly exhausted way of rooms where large things have just concluded, I found OC near the windows. She was looking at the stars outside with the expression of someone who has just set something down after carrying it. For a long time, I stood beside her. We looked at the stars together without speaking for a while. Then I said, "What happens now?" "Now we make sure it holds," she said. "More building?" She made a sound that was nearly a smile. "Always more building." I went back to my archive that night and I wrote for 3 hours. Every world, every name, every moment. And I added all 11,000 names from the graves on the outer Dominion moon to the Sirith archive of the honored, one by one. Each small metal plate with its name and its date. No glory, just names. Every single one. 12 years have passed since the surrender session. I am writing this final entry in my quarters on the rebuilt Sirith homeworld, which is called Velkan now, my name, which I was told only when I arrived for the ceremonial reopening and found the naming plaque on the Capital District's Central Archive building. I protested vigorously and was told, with the gentle and absolute firmness of people who have completely made up their minds, that the archive itself had chosen the name and the archive does not revise its decisions. I have been an archivist long enough to understand that some arguments are not worth having. I am 63 years old. I have held this profession for 42 of those years. I have recorded more in the past 12 than in all the years that came before. Let me tell you what the world looks like now. The Bastion network spans what was once the most dangerous and contested transit corridor in this arm of the galaxy. 11 jointly operated stations, each one a direct architectural descendant of the original Bastion Solus, staffed by personnel from 8 species. with humans providing the primary engineering and command infrastructure that holds the network together. Nothing moves through the corridor without the network's awareness. No threat emerges without a collective response. No species in the coalition faces anything alone. The logic of the original perimeter, the one that OC drew around 17 broken ships on the night we arrived, has simply kept growing. It grew to include our fleet, then the Sea-Wrath colonies, then the freed worlds, then the Then and the others. It kept growing because that is what humans do with perimeters. They are never finished, because there is always one more world on the other side that does not yet have protection, and the humans cannot seem to look at an unprotected world without starting to measure where the walls should go. Our homeworld is being rebuilt. I landed on its surface 3 months ago for the first time in 14 years. I stood in what used to be the central plaza of the old capital city, and I breathed the air, which is still the air of home even though the buildings around it are mostly new. Reconstruction will take another generation, perhaps 2, but it has begun properly with foundations that are meant to last centuries, built by people who intend for them to still be standing long after everyone currently alive is gone. Clara Brent is the chief engineer on the new Central Archive building. She is in her mid-50s now, her hair more gray than it used to be, and she still wipes her hands on her uniform, even in the middle of a conversation that has nothing to do with engineering. When I told her I wanted to speak with her for this final record, she said she would be free in about an hour, and then 3 hours passed because something in the foundation drainage required her attention, and when she finally sat down across from me, on the steps of the half-finished building, with the pale afternoon light of the Sea-Wrath homeworld on her face, she said, "Sorry about that. Where were we?" "Everywhere," I told her. "You have been everywhere." The smile she gave me at that was the most unguarded expression I had seen on her face in 12 years. I asked her what all of it had meant to her. Not the strategy or the politics. The whole of it, from the night the Sea-Wrath fleet arrived at Bastion Solace to this afternoon on a homeworld she helped to rebuild. She was quiet for a while. She looked at the construction site around us, at the scaffolding and the new stone, and the workers from 5 different species moving around each other, with the easy comfort of people who have been doing this long enough to not need to think about it. "It meant we got it right," she said. "This one time, for these people, when it counted. We got it right." She looked at me. "That matters. That has to count." "It counts," I told her. "It is in the archive." I am sitting with Admiral Yara Ose now, at her home on the coast of the second rebuilt Sea-Wrath colony world. This world is named Velshari, for the gate her people held. She chose to live here after her retirement. She chose a Sea-Wrath world when she could have gone anywhere, and she has been here for 4 years, and she watches the ocean every morning, from the step of her small house, as if she genuinely cannot get tired of it. She made tea when I arrived. We sat outside together in the morning light, and the ocean was blue-green and loud, and the local birds cut back and forth over the water in long, curving arcs, and for a while we did not need to say anything. She is 58. She looks like someone who has been put down something very heavy, and found that standing upright again has its own quiet pleasure. I asked her the question I had been saving for the end of this record. The question that Bryn asked on the morning after our fleet docked at Bastion Solace when he looked across a table at a woman he did not know and asked, "Why?" I asked her why. Why all of it? Not the tactical reasoning, not the strategic calculus, not the diplomatic logic. Why does humanity do what it does when someone arrives broken at their door? She looked at the ocean for a long time. Then she said, "We were alone once, a very long time ago, before we had any of this, on a small and ordinary world that the rest of the galaxy did not know about. Things were very hard for us in ways I don't think translate well across species, and no one came. Not because they were cruel, they just didn't come. We didn't exist to them yet." She paused, holding her cup in both hands. "We got through it ourselves, we always do. But we never stopped knowing what it had felt like to be the ones nobody came for." A bird crossed the water below us and curved up into the light. "So, when we got to space," she said, "and started meeting everyone, started understanding how many places in the galaxy are full of people who need someone to come, we had already made a decision. Nobody voted on it. Nobody wrote it down. It was just there in us, from everything that came before. If we ever could, we would be the ones who came. We would be the ones who answered. We would be the ones who built." She looked at me. "Because someone should have built walls for us once. And no one did, and we never forgot what that felt like." I sat with that for a while. The ocean kept moving, the birds kept flying. "Do you think humanity will always be this way?" I asked. She turned and looked at me with those steady eyes that have seen enormous things and remained clear, And she made the warm and completely unguarded laugh of someone who has thought about this question for years and arrived somewhere at peace with the answer. We will argue about it endlessly, she said. Every generation, someone will make a very reasonable case that it is too expensive, or not our problem, or that we should look after ourselves first. And there will be long, serious debates with compelling points on both sides. She looked back at the water, and then somewhere, someone will send a signal into the dark, and we will answer it, and we will build another fortress. I wrote that down in my archive that evening, every word in the exact order she said them. It joins the rest of this record, which is the longest single entry I have made in 42 years of archival work. I want to close the way archivists are trained to close significant records, with a precise account of what was found, what was done, and what it means. What was found: 17 ships carrying 4,000 survivors of a civilization that had been systematically ended by a dominant power that viewed their continued existence as an administrative inconvenience. What was done: a species 1 century into space travel built a fortress around those survivors before their names were known, responded to a diplomatic threat with a single page and 5 words, fought a battle until nothing remained to threaten anyone, liberated every world that had been wronged, built something at every stop, refused to leave anyone unprotected behind them, and then stayed. What it means: I have turned this question over for 12 years and I keep returning to the same answer. The Sireth have a word: Velsan. It means the one who stands between you and the dark. It comes from an old time, before space travel, when the dark meant the actual darkness of a world, without enough light in the things that moved through it. We used a word for those who held the perimeter so that others could rest. It had not been used much in the modern age because the modern age had not produced many people who fully deserved it. We are using it again. We are using it for humans specifically, officially, by vote of the Sireth Council, recorded in the archive, permanent and without expiration. But I want to end with a memory rather than a word, because the archive is for memories too, not only for events. The Sireth Collective is not the same civilization that fled its homeworld on 17 broken ships. That civilization was shocked and devastated and running, and it is not an insult to our history to say so. We were those things. What we are now is something that came after those things, and it is worth saying clearly what the difference is. We are not larger now, though our numbers have grown. We are not more powerful in the military sense, though the protection of the Bastion network means we do not face threats the way we once did. What is different is something I have been trying to name for 12 years, and have only recently found words for. We are not afraid of the dark anymore, not in the way we were. The fear is not gone, because fear is a functional response to genuine danger, and the galaxy is not without genuine danger. But the specific fear of existing in a universe that might decide your species is expendable. The fear that kept our council in permanent emergency session for 2 generations before the war, and which shaped every diplomatic calculation we made in my lifetime as an archivist. That fear has changed its shape. It changed its shape because of what we know now. We know, from direct experience recorded in this archive, and in the memories of every Sireth alive today, that the universe also contains the kind of people who build walls, the kind who answer signals, the kind who stand at the door of a children's ward through a long night, because it is the right place to be. The fear does not go away, but it shares the space with something else now, something that was not there before. I asked Osi once, in a conversation I did not record at the time, because I was not carrying my recorder, whether she thought the Sireth had changed since the war. She said she had noticed us becoming more willing to speak first in coalition meetings. I said I thought that was accurate. She said she thought it was because we no longer expected every room to be hostile. That is a precise and generous observation. She was right. We had spent so many years in rooms where we assumed hostility that we had forgotten rooms could be otherwise. And then we spent a decade in rooms where someone had decided without being asked to make the rooms safe. And we started to speak first. If that is all the humans had done, if the only thing that came from all of this was that the Sireth people learned to speak first in rooms, it would still be worth everything it cost. G. Harlow is 42 years old now. He still lives on a Sireth world, which he did not plan when he first came. He arrived for the reconstruction work as a structural surveyor and later a project engineer. And somewhere in those years of work, he stopped thinking of it as a temporary assignment and started thinking of it as home. He has a small house near the coast, about 3 kilometers from Osi's. He said to me once, when I asked him why he stayed, that he likes being near people who understand what they came from. There are others like him. Francis Okafor is now the senior medical director for 3 Sirith colony worlds, having formally requested the posting. When her service contract ended and she could have gone home, she said, at the press briefing, where she announced it, that she was not finished yet, which was the most Francis Okafor thing I could imagine anyone saying. She is 62 years old, and she works the way she has always worked, continuously, and the rebuilt Sirith worlds are healthier because of what she built here. Pete Aldrich became the communications director for the Bastion Network's Central Coordination Hub. He is 36 now, running an operation of extraordinary complexity with the same quality I first noticed in him at his board during the battle. That fundamental calm under pressure that the humans seem to train for more deeply than anything else. When I visited the hub last year, Pete showed me the wall in the main communications center, where they had put the names of everyone who died at Velshari Gate. He looked at it for a moment and said, "We owe them the thing staying built." Owen Marsh left the military after the campaign and became one of the primary diplomatic architects of what is now called the New Compact, the governing framework of the coalition. It is not a perfect document. Owen will describe its imperfections to you at length, because he knows them intimately. But it holds and it grows, and it is the foundation of the perimeter that now covers more worlds than anyone expected it to cover when it was first drawn. Around 17 broken ships. There is a small memorial on Bastion Solus, near the docking bays where our fleet was birthed on the first night. The station's crew added it 6 years ago after a proposal from one of the Sirith officers who now serves aboard it, which is its own remarkable thing. Sirith officers serve at every level of the Bastion network now, including command positions. The memorial is a panel of dark metal with 2 things on it. The first is the date our fleet arrived. The second is a quote from my own archive, which remains the strangest experience I have ever had as a writer, reading my own words on a wall. They do not wait to be asked. They see someone in need, and they immediately begin building walls around them. I stand in front of that panel every time I visit the station. It still does to me what it did the first time I read it there, unexpectedly. On an inspection visit 3 years after the installation, it stops me, not from sadness, from something harder to name. The specific feeling you get when you realize that something you lived through has become, for others, history. It is history now. But it was real first. It was real, and it was done by people with names and faces and habits and the particular quality of not waiting to be asked. I will spend the years I have left finding the names I do not yet know and writing them down. Because that is what archivists do, and because they deserve it. On the day I returned to the Sirath homeworld, before any ceremony, before the naming of the capital district, I stood alone at the edge of what had been the central plaza of the old city. The buildings around me were ruins in various stages of clearance. The ground under my feet still held the evidence of what had happened. I stood there without moving for a long time. Then I heard footsteps. I turned around and it was G. Harlow, older, late 30s, no longer in uniform, working with the reconstruction team as a structural surveyor. He had been on this world for 6 months. He had not known I was coming. We looked at each other, and neither of us tried to find words that were adequate, because there were no words adequate to it, and we both seemed to understand that at the same time. So he did not say anything, and I did not say anything. He nodded. The same quiet nod he had given me in the corridor of Bastion Solace on the first night, when the children were sleeping behind him and the dark waited outside. I nodded back. He turned and walked back to his work. I watched him cross the ruined plaza with his measuring equipment and his data slate, moving toward the section of the site where the new archive building was going to stand, because that was what he had been asked to survey this week. He stopped at